Hi guys, I'm Robert with the Department of Technology, and today I'm going to show you how to break down and reassemble the Lenovo 11E ThinkPad. First thing that we're going to do is you start with the underside, and you're going to remove screws here on this case that covers up the battery and pretty much all the guts that you're going to need to get to. And these screws don't actually come out. They have little retention springs or brackets that hold them in place on the back, so if they don't come off like a normal screw does, it's okay, it's supposed to do that. Okay, next thing you're going to do is you're going to take the battery out, and there are 3 screws for that right here, and then there's also a little stopper here in this 4th hole where you would think a screw would be. Some computers will have that, some won't. Taking out the battery can be a little tricky, and you want to do it right because the connector on the board can sometimes yank the wires and you can mess up the connector itself. So when you're pulling it out, you want to kind of slowly lift the battery out and then take your finger and push back on the wires. You're not going to pull them out, don't be afraid to. Like that. So don't actually use this little thing they put on there. One, you're probably not going to be able to, and 2, I've had problems in the past ripping off the edges of these clips, and then you can have a bad battery or it won't go in quite right. So when you're pulling it out, you want to kind of position your finger right against the wires like this and pull back. Don't be afraid to, you're not going to pull the wires out from the connector. Next thing that we're going to do is remove the hard drive. It's fairly simple, there's only 1 screw. Just lift up on the tab and disconnect it. Next thing you're going to do is we're going to go through and remove all the screws that actually connect the upper frame and the lower frame together. So you have these 2 plastic or rubber stoppers here on the corners, and those hold a couple of little brass screws in place. We're going to remove those. And then you also have 4 other frame screws along the top here we're going to take out as well. You might want to separate all these ones out because now you're going to start getting ones of different lengths, so just keep them all together. So now that you've got those removed, you're going to go through and we're going to remove the remainder of the screws that we're concerned with on the bottom here. It's going to start with these little 2x4s which are marked on here, and there's 4 on the bottom. 2 of them hold the keyboard in place, this one and this one. So if you're ever removing the keyboard, you really only have to take those 2 out. At this point, it's probably a good idea to start disconnecting these connectors that are on the motherboard. We can remove them from here. These tabs, they work okay. Over time, these plastic connectors will probably end up breaking though, and you might have to use your plastic wedge spud tool to take them off, but mine are okay, so I'm just gonna pull them up. Yeah, see. The hard drive cable, it's short and it goes right along here, but it's different from these connectors in that it has 2 little additional plastic clips on the side, and it can make it difficult to remove at this point. You can, but you risk kind of breaking those or damaging the area around it. So sometimes it's better to just wait until you get down to the motherboard level after we've removed the keyboard to disconnect this piece. For the next section, we're going to start getting around to actually turning the laptop over and starting to remove the keyboard and go from there. But to get to there, we have these 4 2x2s that we need to remove first. So we're going to go ahead and do that. Now these 2 screws here actually don't have anything to do with this lower frame. They actually are from a piece of the upper frame. They're on the back side of the mouse pad. And you really don't need to remove them unless you want to, or if you're swapping out the mouse pad itself, or just what, but 99% of the time you can just leave them both in place. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to flip the laptop over and get rid of the keyboard. And with the keyboard, you have these little plastic clips that kind of hold it in place under this front lip here, and it seats itself along the back as well. So you want to take your plastic tool, you can use the metal one as well, and you're going to want to start prying underneath very gently. I usually go around the Windows key and the Control key, and I avoid the whole spacebar area if I can, because it's kind of flimsy there, and you don't want to crack the keyboard. It's no fun to replace. So all you have to do to actually remove the keyboard at this point is just move it forward about 1 millimeter or 2, and you'll see this back lip come free of the frame, and just bring it out like that. Sometimes the ribbon will disconnect itself, other times it won't. Probably shouldn't. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the 2x4 screws that are underneath the keyboard here, and those are actually what kind of the last screws we're concerned with that connect the upper frame to the lower frame. And the last thing that's going on here is you have this little ribbon connector right here that goes onto the system board, and you're going to want to take that out. And you can use the little tab on this one. Be a little careful with it. Try not to pull up too much because the connector on the board can be kind of fragile. You just want to kind of play with it until you can see it start sliding out, and then it's free. Now that we've gotten the ribbon disconnected and the 4 screws taken out from here, I'm actually going to separate the upper frame from the lower. The way we're going to do that is you're going to bring the laptop up, and you're probably going to want to use your metal tool, spudge tool for this, but your plastic one can work. It's really thin here in the middle, so you need to be kind of careful. So you're just going to put that in between the frames and then just kind of start playing with it along the front here until you can hear it start popping. There you have that separated out. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to start removing the screws from the motherboard, and then eventually I'm going to get to a point where I can separate the lower frame and the motherboard and the screen all from each other. So there's 3 screws here on the motherboard that we're going to take out. First one's up here by the hard drive ribbon. It's good to keep these ones separate. 2 of them are the little 2x4s that we have plenty of, but over here you see these brackets. And I try to keep them separate because there is a different screw here on the bottom. There's a silver one, and you want to keep that one there because if you put it in the wrong place, over time you can get some corrosion around there if you use the wrong kind of screw. And this is magnetic, so it should just lift right out. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to remove the frame and the motherboard. So first thing you want to do is here on the fan, there's a screw. It doesn't quite come out all the way, just like the back plate. It just comes out a little bit. Unscrew it until you hear it start clicking, and then you know it's going to be loose. And then you can start with the frame. There's going to be 5 screws around the back that you're going to take off. For these ones, you're also going to want to keep them separate because it's a different kind of screw. It's about the same length as a 2x4, but they're a lot thicker because they're holding the bracket in place. So just be careful with that. There's going to be a screw on the frame here that hangs out underneath this little piece of adhesive on the power adapter, and you can just get that out of the way. Something that's good to note is when you're putting this back together, which I'll show you later, there's arrows wherever a screw needs to go. So, or you can just remember these 2 on the end don't have screws. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to remove the system board or motherboard from the frame, and then we're going to separate the frame out from the screen. With the hard drive cable, like I said earlier, it's kind of fragile, at least this piece on the back is. So you can see there's clips along here. What you want to do is at this point, before we take out the motherboard, is you want to kind of weave that along and get it out because it can break those clips. And we're just going to kind of gently lift along here until things come out. You might need to grab the edges of the frame and kind of gently pull along them to make sure everything comes out of place. Next thing that you're going to want to do, as you can see, the power adapter here is actually a separate piece. I like to remove it before I actually pull the board out rather than pulling it out with the board. So you want to take this piece along the back of the plastic here. It feels kind of flimsy. It's okay, same as the battery cable. You can just grab onto it and pull. Just like that. And then you have the board separated out. Power adapter usually just pops right out, just like that. So to actually remove the lower frame, all we're going to do is what I do is I put my thumbs on the frame here and I hold it in place and I gently, from the bottom, fold it as if it was still connected. And on the back, you have all these wires. Just lift on them and pull them along. and then they should just feed back out through here. They also have little plastic clips as well that you might want to be careful with so they don't break too. And then all you have to do is take it off. So next, I'm actually going to show you how to take apart the screen. You can do this without tearing your laptop down entirely like we've done, but since I'm at this point, it's already separated out, I'm going to go ahead and show you anyways. So there's 2 screws on the front, one in each corner here underneath these little plastic squares, and you kind of have to mess with them to get them out. Sometimes they pop off like that. They're adhesive, so you can just put them to the side. Sometimes they get a little bit mangled. That's just kind of how it goes. Just like that. And then we're going to take those screws out. And these, you're going to want to keep these screws separate as well because they are a different size and type than most of the others. Next thing we're going to do is you're going to take one of your pry tools, probably the plastic one's the better one to go with, and very, very carefully you're going to run it along all the sides of the screen here. And it can get kind of hairy down here at the bottom because there's a board that sits under there where all the touch sensitivity connectors are. So you want to be very careful when you're coming along the bottom. So I like to start at the top here. And you want to get in between. You don't want to go too far in with your tool though, because you might start messing with the screen and you could crack it. So be very, very, very careful and delicate when you're doing this. Like I said, you just want to be really careful with it because this is kind of a delicate process. You should hear all the connectors kind of pop all the way around. And very carefully, as you can see, we're actually kind of getting somewhere now. So, and this is the fun part. You're going to do the same thing, just along this bottom piece. And you need to be very, very, very careful when you're doing this part. Some of the components to be aware of underneath here. You have the webcam along the top here, and microphone. You also have the Bluetooth and Wi-Fi antennas. As you can see, the wires go all the way around the edges here, and then go down and connect into the board. On the other side here, you actually have the screen itself. And then you have these ribbons here, which are important because this one right here is a specific one that is, it's responsible for touch functionality on the screen itself. At this point, I'm not actually going to remove this part of the screen because it's very delicate, and normally you wouldn't want to do that unless that screen is being replaced because it's broken, and I really don't want to run the risk of breaking this. So we're just going to keep it in place for now, and if you ever have to have it removed, then that's a one-time deal, and you just remove these screws here and lift up with a pry tool and disconnect the connectors. At this point, we're going to go ahead and begin putting things back together on the laptop, starting with the screen. So pretty much just walk it back from where you were before. Yeah, it's a lot easier actually. Then just going to gently kind of let things clip themselves back together all along. It might help to set it down and do this. You want to check as well because you don't want pieces remaining separated out like that because that can cause you problems later on. Then we're going to get those 2 screws. We'll put them back on. So after you get both of the screws back in, you're going to put those little adhesive squares back on top of the screws. And then you have the screen back together. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to reconnect the screen to the lower frame. So these wires here that go to the antennas and to the touchscreen and all, you want to make sure that those stay inside of these little areas where the brackets are going to go. And you also want to make sure that the little feet here for the frame sit right down in their place. So when you're putting these feet back in their place before you put the screws on them, it's useful to kind of make sure that they're at as close to the same angle as you can. So once you get them in place, you'll see these little divots popping out. Kind of take your thumb and push on them and let the frame seat itself down so that you can kind of let the screen just sit there. Or you can do that. And then you're going to take your frame screws and we're going to put those in to the spaces on here, the 5 that have arrows on them. The frame might flex and bend a little bit, and that's okay. Just so long as you've got those little divots in place, it should be all right. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to get these tucked back underneath so that we can get the board moved back in. Along the sides here, you can see that we have these little plastic pieces where you're supposed to route the cables along. So we want to make sure that we get everything tucked in there nicely. And then just kind of drop things down into those squares there. And they can just hang out for a little while until we get back to the bottom side of the laptop. This gray cable here, sometimes I actually circumvent this little connector right here because the length of it can be a little funny with the wireless card when you're bringing it back through here. So it's totally okay to just take that wire and instead of taking this antenna one right here and going that way, just go straight through right here. At this point, we're ready to put the board back in. And what we're going to do is first you're going to put the power adapter back on. And it should just pop right into place like that. At this point also, with the motherboard, you can see we have the fan here. There's 4 screws. They have springs in them so they don't actually come out all the way. If you were going to remove the fan and do work on it, you could do it at this point. You just disconnect the power cord here and then it's numbered. The order that you need to remove the screws in, and it's 1, 2, 3, and 4. You want to do that in that order so that we ensure that there's enough thermal paste underneath spreading evenly across the processor. It's really important for the heating and cooling of the laptop to do that. So you could do that at this point if you're going to replace the fan or apply more paste. But for now, we're just going to go ahead and get the board back on. So you're going to take it, flip it over so this side is up, and just kind of set things in place. And as you're setting it back down, over here, this is a good time to take the hard drive cable and get back in its place before you start putting screws back in, because these plastic connectors here are kind of in the way and this is a really tight squeeze. So what you're going to want to do is kind of tuck this underneath that piece and then kind of set things down. And take one of your tools and kind of press along that cable and just get everything back in place. And give it a little pull there just to make sure that everything is set. And just get it out of the way. So to screw the board back on, we have 3 screws like I showed you earlier. And I like to start up here by the hard drive cable, mainly because it helps make sure that it's still in place. Something that's also important to note while I'm up in this area is these are the 3 connectors on the board that control all the power and the volume buttons. And a lot of the times you're going to see these breaking for student computers. If they drop their laptop and it breaks the frame there, this little piece might be broken, and that's the power button. And if that's gone, that's a board replacement. So that's one of the times that you're going to be getting into the board like this. You want to get these frame pieces, you want to put them back in their place, starting with this chromed one. Like I was saying, the order of the screws does matter. It's to avoid corrosion. Different kinds of metal touching each other can cause corrosion. So we'll take the black 2x4 screw and we're going to put it at the top here. And then we're going to take this other little foot here, set it down, take our chrome screw, and put it in its place. Then just kind of make sure everything's set. Lastly, we're going to make sure this fan piece is screwed tightly down all the way. Doesn't take much. Be gentle with it because this is a plastic frame and it can crack if you over tighten that. Next thing that we're going to do is we're going to put the upper frame back on. It's pretty simple. You just kind of start from the back here, and you want to make sure this cable stays free because if it gets tucked underneath, you can have problems. So just make sure it kind of hangs out there. Something that's important to note is when you're putting these back on, especially with student laptops because they are a little rougher with them and they end up dropping them. On the back here, by the hinges, sometimes this won't completely seal all the way. Mine actually is behaving. Normally they don't, but I take care of mine. So along the edge right here, sometimes it'll be separated out, and that's okay. If you try and pop it back into place, it'll just come back out sometimes. Try and work around it until we get to a point where you're putting these frame screws back in and it'll all set back together. So we're just going to make sure everything is tight and in place, and then we're going to go ahead and start putting screws back in, reconnecting things, and putting the keyboard back on. Doesn't take much to get all these ribbons and connectors back in place, so just be a little bit gentle with them. There's a black line along these connectors as well, which shows when this little door shuts, if it's seated all the way. Next, we're going to go ahead and put the screws back in, all four on this side. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to put the keyboard back on. So just make sure the little keyboard door is open here. When you're putting the keyboard back on, just like with the other ribbons, there's a white line here. And you're just going to open up the keyboard door here, set it back in place, and then shut the door, and it should line up on the white line there. Very, very gently, because you don't want to pull too much, otherwise that can come undone. You're going to actually put the keyboard in from back to front again, and you're going to set it back there and give it a little push because it seats back about a millimeter or two. And you're just going to set it down in the front and run your hand along it like that. Next thing we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're going to flip the laptop over again. And we're going to start putting things back in place here with the antenna cables and with the connectors. So I never actually took this hard drive cable off because, like I said, it's kind of a pain. You really don't want to do it unless you have to, but the time to do that would be when I had the board removed. You could just disconnect it at that point. But we're going to start with the antenna cables here, and they just kind of line up and pop into place. And then the best way, I think, to get these antenna wires back in place is probably with one of your tools here. You can start with your hand and then just go through and tuck it back in later, which is what I'm going to do for the most part. So as you can tell, I'm kind of guiding it with my hands and then using this tool here, the front of it, to make sure I'm getting that antenna wire tucked underneath these little clips here, like all along. So, and then I would just leave that hanging for now until we get this other one in place. This one's a little bit more fun. It's a lot longer, and it's important that when you're putting everything back together that before you put before you tighten the screen down and put the upper frame back on, that this is pulled all the way through, because if you have this wire tucked underneath somewhere in there when you put everything back together, it's not going to be long enough to reconnect to the Wi-Fi. So just be careful about that. It may not quite root itself underneath all of these connectors, but so long as it's under most of them or it's not hanging out on the plastic board top here itself, you should be okay. So now that we have those in place, you're going to reconnect them. So these little coaxial connectors are, you got to be careful with them. They're not fragile necessarily, but you don't want to be rough with them at all. Normally, it's black to black, gray or white to gray or white. Well, on these Lenovos, actually, they come to us from the factory the other way around. So make sure you're going black to white and gray to black. When you're connecting these, it's kind of hard to do with your hands. They just snap on. So you might want to position it with your finger and then take the flat end of your tool here and then just kind of put it into place. You can twist these connectors around if you need to. And then just gotta kind of gently mess with it until it snaps on. There we go. Now that one's in place, and let's get the second one here. Now it's good to just kind of press on it and make sure it's really in place, because they like to pop loose sometimes. For the screws connecting the lower frame to the upper frame, we're going to start with the 2x2s that were underneath the battery here, and we're going to start putting those back in. And then we're going to start working on the frame and the keyboard screws with the 2x4s. You can really do it in any order at this point. And then we're going to put these little brass screws back in the corners here. You want to be careful not to over tighten them because the plastic along the hard drive here, or solid state here, tends to crack along the screw, and that's been a problem for us in the past, so just be careful that you don't quite over tighten, especially that one there. And then you can put the little feet back on. And then we're going to take the hard drive, we're going to put it back in place. You want to make sure everything's lined up the right way. And then tuck it back under there. And screw it back down onto the board. And then lastly, we're going to put the frame screws back in place along the top. And then we're going to put the battery back in. And when you're doing this, it's always good to set it in the back like that, and then put the connector in, and then the screws. Otherwise, it can be really hard to get the connector in place. So you can use the tool to do this, or you can take your thumb and just make sure everything's kind of lined up, and then just give it a gentle push. And there's a little white circle that should be about halfway covered underneath this connector if it's in place correctly. And then to finish up, we're going to put the 3 screws back in place on the battery. Back things over. And then we're going to put the lower case cover back on. You have these clips along the bottom here, and they're going to set on this edge. And then you also have these clips on the side, one on each. And you want to make sure that they all get into place nicely, because sometimes they like to hang over the edge and cause you some problems. Just kind of give it a light push, make sure everything's good, and then you can go ahead and screw everything back on. And we have a working laptop.